A stats by Buzzsprout shows that 29% of new listeners find podcasts through search and about 21% find it through podcast recommendation. In this video, I'll show you how to optimize your podcast or what are the tips that you need to keep in mind in order to ensure that more and more people are recommending your podcast to other listeners. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. This is Dilip. If you're new here and you don't know me, then I'm a podcaster, blogger, and affiliate marketer. I run the show, The Podcasting University, which is all about podcasting and podcasting tips. And in this channel, I share a lot of practical and implementable podcasting tips that you can use to get started with your own podcast. And if you're looking to get started with your own podcast, then you might want to join my 10-day free e-course, which is about getting started with your own podcast. It'll teach you everything that you need to know about starting your own podcast. You'll be able to find a link to the course in the description below. Go ahead and join the course today itself. New listener acquisition. Now, one of the things that most podcasters struggle with is finding new listeners for their show. In fact, getting listens and downloads is the topmost priority for any podcaster who's starting a podcast. But how do you get all of these listeners? Now, stats show that there are primarily three different ways that you can use to get new listeners for your podcast. The first one is through search engines. The second one is through podcast recommendations. And the third one is through social media. SEO is a completely different topic which will help you rank your podcast on search engines, which is something that I'll do maybe in another video. But for this video, we are going to talk about word of mouth or podcast recommendations and how you can optimize your podcast, or what are the things that you need to keep in mind in order to ensure that your podcast is being recommended by a lot of people to others, and that way it is discovered. Word of mouth or recommendations. It's not just something that is used by podcasters or used in podcasting. In fact, a lot of brands and businesses rely on word of mouth to get the word out there and to build their businesses. The entire network marketing industry is based on word of mouth. That is how it runs. In fact, affiliate marketing is also all about recommending products that you believe in to others and thereby earning commission. In fact, a lot of the professional services, people into these professional services also rely on word of mouth to get the word out about their business and their reputation and thereby grow their business. So word of mouth is something that is used by a lot of businesses in order to grow. And similarly in podcasting, word of mouth plays a very important role in terms of listener acquisition or new listener acquisition. I read about 40 plus books in the last year. And almost 80% of those books, around 39 books, were something that I discovered through recommendations, through videos that I used to watch or through podcasters that I follow. So those books were recommended by them, and that's how I found those books. Similarly, there were about 5 podcasts that I started listening to solely because somebody recommended that podcast and I started listening to them. I listen to about 14 different podcasts on a regular basis. And that means that about 33% of the podcast that I'm listening to is something that I discovered through recommendation. So if your podcast is not being recommended by your friends, your social media circles, and your listeners to others, then you're losing a big chunk of your new listeners. So it is important that you focus on podcast recommendation a lot. And here I'm going to share with you 7 tips that can help you get the most out of your podcast recommendation. Number 1, make your content recommendable. So it all starts with your content. If your content is not something that can be recommended by people to others, or if it doesn't offer value to your existing listeners, then it is highly unlikely that your podcast is going to be recommended to others. So the first and the foremost thing that you need to keep in mind is to create content that is powerful. Create content that offers value to your existing listeners. Only then will your existing listeners recommend your podcast to others. So create valuable content. Number 2, make podcast recommendation requests as a call to action. Keep in mind that you have to ask people to take an action. You have to explicitly ask people to take an action if you want them to take an action. And if you're not doing it, your listeners are not going to do anything after listening to your podcast. So call to action is an important part of any podcast, and using podcast recommendation as a call to action is the most powerful thing that you can do in order to gain new listeners. So in every episode, ensure that you are requesting your listeners to recommend your podcast to their friends, to their social media circles who might be interested in that same topic. Ensure that you're using your call to action which asks people to recommend your show to others. So make podcast recommendation as a call to action for your podcast. Number 3, make recommendations as easy as possible. Now, keep in mind that the more friction involved in taking an action, the less likely people are to take an action. So ensure that you're making it as easy as possible to recommend your podcast. The easiest way to do that is to put a website in place and ask your listeners to direct their friends and social media circles to that website. And if that website is something that can easily be remembered or memorized, then it is going to be absolutely easy for them to go and recommend your podcast to others. But if you think that you don't want to put together a website, instead you want to use a URL shortening service to direct your new listeners to your favorite listening platform like there are Spotify or maybe Apple Podcasts, then absolutely go and do it. You can do it using Bitly or any other URL shortening service of your choice. But then again, I would say that it is going to be a little more difficult than recommending a website, and that might lead to lesser conversions on recommendation. So I would recommend using a website, but if you think that you want to use a URL shortening service, you can always use that. Another thing that you can do is to ask your friends or your listeners to forward a link to your podcast to their listeners. But then again, it is going to be difficult because they'll have to use an email service in order to forward it after listening to your podcast. So there is going to be some friction involved and the conversions might not be that great. Number 4, incentivize your audience for recommending. Now, people look for what's in it for me before they take any action. And it is important that you give them a reason to take an action. So when it comes to podcast recommendations, if you can incentivize your audience for recommending your podcast to others, the conversions can be excellent. So look at how you can incentivize them. Maybe you can give them a free download like a free PDF or a free checklist in order to recommend your podcast to others. So look at different ways that you can use to get people to recommend your podcast to others. And if you are able to incentivize your listeners, then your conversions are going to be absolutely amazing. So look at how you can incentivize your audience for recommending your podcast to others. Number 5, use your social media circles for recommending. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that we do when we start off with our podcast is not using our existing connections and existing social media circles to help with recommending our podcast. So use your social media circles to make people recommend your podcast. Reach out to your friends, reach out to your relatives, reach out to your social media circles and ask them to recommend your show to people who will be interested in that topic. And if you can make recommending easy for them, your conversions are going to be absolutely amazing. What you can probably do is put together a post which talks about your podcast and forward that to your social media circles or to your friends and ask them to post that on their social media platforms or their social media profiles. This can bring in a lot of new listeners and it will make their life easier in order to recommend your podcast. And don't forget to use your email subscribers. If you already have an email list, then use your email subscribers and reach out to them, ask them to recommend your podcast to others. And ensure that you are making it as easy as possible for them to recommend. The simplest thing to do is just ask them to forward that email to people who might be interested in your podcast. That is the easiest thing to do. Just put a link in there or maybe just put links to all of those platforms that you recommend people to listen to your podcast on, and they can just forward that email to their friends, social media circles and recommend your podcast. Number 6, promo swaps. Now this is something that I've tried with pretty much all of my podcasts and we found a lot of value and we've acquired a lot of new listeners using promo swaps. So promo swaps essentially means that you are swapping a small promo ad with another podcaster. Now they're going to play that promo in their podcast and you are going to play their promo in your podcast. So most of the times these promo swaps happen between podcasts that are of the equal download size, but it's always possible that some big podcasters agree to share your promo on their podcast as well. But all of this depends upon how good your outreach to other podcasters is. So reach out to other podcasters on social media circles, using emails, talk to them. You might have to follow up a couple of times, but talk to them and talk to them about how it will benefit both of you. Then send them a small promo audio that they can use on their podcast. Whatever you do, promo swaps work amazingly well. So look at how you can reach out to other podcasters to get promos done on their shows. This is the best way of promoting your podcast, and you will get a lot of new listeners. We found that most of the listeners who we acquired using promo swaps stuck with the podcast for a longer time, and our listenership didn't go down once it went up. So you might want to use promo swaps to get new listeners to your show. And the seventh and the final one, use paid ads. Now, if you have a marketing budget and if you're planning to run ads to promote your podcast, then I would recommend running ads on other podcasts. I don't recommend running ads on Facebook or Google because the conversions are pretty low and you will burn your pocket or lose a lot of money in those ads. Instead, reach out to podcasters and talk to them about what they would charge in order to play a small promo of your podcast on their podcast. They'll happily agree to it because it's a monetization option for them. Talk to them and run these paid ads. You can also use Buzzsprout ads, which is all about running these kind of promos on other podcasts. There, you don't even have to look at what are the download numbers, what is the size of that podcast. Bigger podcasts might also be running your promos, which will get you a lot of new listeners. But the prices might be a little on the higher side, but that entirely depends upon your marketing budget. If your marketing budget permits, then go and run these paid ads on the podcast because it helps in new listener acquisition a lot. The only thing that you might want to keep in mind when you're running these paid ads is that you might want to customize your promo according to these podcasts. So ensure that you're targeting their audience and creating a custom promo for each of those podcasts. That way your conversions will be much better. So those were the 7 tips to get the most out of word of mouth or podcast recommendations. I hope you liked all of the information that I shared in today's video. If you did, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification. And if you like this video, then do give a thumbs up to this video because that will help others find this video. I'll be back again the next week with more information around podcasting. But if you're looking to get started with your podcast, then don't forget to join my 10-day e-course on getting started with your podcast. You'll be able to find a link to the course in the description below. Go ahead and join the course today itself. And you'll be able to find a link to most of my recommended podcasting tools in the description. These are affiliate links. If you click those links and choose to buy from them, then I might earn a small commission with no additional cost to you. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below and I would respond to all of that. And if there is a need, I'll create a video around those questions as well. So that's all that I have for this video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting, practical and implementable podcasting tip. Until then, keep watching TPU TV.